Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here, Rick.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So you are an executive, and I think in your Substack description, you describe yourself as a pretty big deal formally.
Yes.
You went from like this like high level executive role to taking a sabbatical to now writing a post-apocalyptic fiction book. How did that happen?
Yeah, no, it's funny you called that out. One of my book ideas is memoirs of a very important businessman or something like that. Just poking fun of myself and my self-importance, especially with my former life. But yeah, the story goes following going to college. I was in consulting for a while, very kind of vanilla, boring corporate job. And then after that, stumbled into a healthcare startup called Privia Health, where I was one of the first employees and was there for 12 years. It ended up being a phenomenal success, which is very rare in the startup world. I don't necessarily recommend that path for most other people, but we ended up going public. And through that whole journey, I had to really reinvent myself several times along the way, from kind of a young go-getter hustler type to a public company executive where, I'm talking to the board. I've hundreds of employees reporting to me, all that stuff. And I went through that journey, and after the company went public, decided that it was time for me to go. The company was getting large again. I was starting to feel suffocated by familiar large company problems. And I'd always had the dream of starting my own company. I was always in love with entrepreneurship. Of course, in my 20s, idolized Steve Jobs, right? Very cliche, but that's really who I idolized. And so I thought, okay, I've had this startup experience as an early employee. I've helped the company grow and become successful. Okay, what's the next thing that one does in that situation, which is start my own company? So after I left Privia, I decided, hey, I'm going to take 3 months off. I'm going to get bored, and then I'm going to start this company. But long story short, the 3 months ended up being, I guess you could say, 2 years through a lot of twists and turns. Insert a massive midlife crisis, and stumbled upon writing over the last about 2 years, most recently in fiction. So that was kind of the long intro, and we can dabble into whichever one of those pieces you want to go.
I guess what I'm curious about is you said that you left that role already thinking, okay, well, I'll just take a short break and then I'll go start a company because that's what I really want to do. And then that got extended to like a 2-year sabbatical. But like, what actually happened during that sabbatical that made you realize, like, actually, I need a longer break? Or was it just accidental that you just couldn't find the energy to start the company? Or like, because I think I read that you had a list of like 100 companies or something, or 100 company ideas or something like this.
Yeah, I have a Notion document that has kind of a database of over 100 different ideas that even before had started to build some concepts. And, I was really plugged into the startup world, healthcare in particular. We were doing things on the cutting edge before. So, I knew VCs and investors, and the founder of the last company wanted to back me and help build a new company with me. And so I had all that support and infrastructure. And I remember when I left my last company, I had a very brief vacation, about a week, to the beach with family. And I remember thinking like, oh, this is amazing. Like, no one's calling me. No, there's no major crisis might be happening if I just check my email and so on. And it was fantastic for that week. But then the next week, I just crashed. I was like, what am I doing? Where am I going? Who am I? And so on. And I really suppressed all that angst into trying to start a new company. And so that's where I got to work on those 100 ideas, filtering and sorting them, building out the ideas, talking to potential customers, talking to investors. And for the next 3 months, I was just plowing on that idea and concept of, okay, I got to get out of this angst by filling that hole with the next new thing. But about 3 months in, sort of things were progressively coming to a head. And I remember this conversation I had with a mentor of mine. She was actually an executive coach of mine while I was at the company trying to become an executive, right? Trying to become a really big deal. And she helped me through that time. So I reached out to her again, and I talked to her and I said, just something doesn't feel right. Like, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know why I'm doing this. Something really feels off. I didn't have an answer. I didn't have any alternative path identified to know this doesn't feel right and or why it doesn't feel right. I had no explanation for that, and I had no idea what the alternative is. And she basically suggested that I just go dark. I kind of go off in the wilderness, stop building, stop talking to business people, get outside your network and do whatever you got to do. Leave the country, read, write, don't do anything public. And that's what I did for probably the next 6 months after that, where I just went into my hole and took long walks, started writing to myself, which ended up being what I over time published on The Way of Work. And that just going through my angst and midlife crisis is my story of how I kind of worked through it.
It sounds kind of scary because, I mean, you had to basically tap into that very uncomfortable energy of like, I actually am lost and I don't really know what I'm going to do. And I don't have an answer. Like the thing that I thought I wanted to do might not be the answer. And it also
Yeah.
sounds like there wasn't really a time frame. Like you just like had to go and go dark and just wait and see what happened basically. Or like try a bunch of stuff and see what happened.
Yeah. No, I think it's absolutely right. I'm a kind of classic type A, high achiever, very high strung, build project plans and goals and reverse engineer to say, okay, I want to hit this goal. And so minus 12 months from there, I need to do this and then that and then that. And so, I thought I had that all planned out. And I was really on the precipice of achieving my dreams, basically. My dreams was I was going to have this successful startup experience, accumulate a war chest, which would allow me to start a company on my own terms. And I did all that. And I was like on the precipice, like about to like plant my flag. And then I was like, well, why do I want to do that? And yeah, I think the whole process that where I went through going dark, and I wrote about a lot of these experiences where I tried to disappear. I tried to embrace being unproductive and really resisting all my urges to do things that were things I should do, and instead try to really focus on things I really felt more intrinsically that I wanted to do. And like you almost have to rediscover your own wants and interests if you've been conditioned for so long to chase some of these external rewards. And yeah, it was just kind of that regrounding of myself and then peeling back the layers to say, who really am I? Am I this really important business person guy? No, I'm not, right? Am I this worker who am defined by my output? And if I don't achieve big things, if I don't make a dent in this universe, then I'm nothing. I really had to kind of unpack all that about myself because I could have easily really plowed into the next new thing and woken up a decade later and being like, okay, I just pushed off all those existential questions again. And so that wilderness phase is one of the hardest to explain to other people because I like this analogy I read from this book by William Bridges called Transitions. And in the book, he talks about there's transitions all throughout life. It could be losing a job. It could be going through a divorce, losing someone you love, like through death, moving. It could be all sorts of transitions. And most people, when they approach a transition, think of it as crossing the road. I'm on this side of the road and I need to get to the other side of the road as soon as possible. And so the transition, when you're in the road, the absolute worst thing people think you should do is sit down in the middle of the road, right? You need to sprint to the other side, is what people think. But in my experience, to successfully come out a transition better on the other side, you need to sit down in the middle of all that traffic in the middle of the road, or use the analogy of going into the wilderness and getting lost. And you need to sit with the lostness for a long time. It's very uncomfortable. But ironically, it is by embracing that lostness that you end up finding your way through rather than trying to find your way through immediately from the start, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that feels very relevant to where I am at right now. I read your article recently about getting lost and I worried that I maybe don't give myself enough time to actually be lost. And I noticed for myself that the temptation is, as someone who's ambitious and also does want to get meaning from my work and does try to do work that's meaningful, I feel like I do latch on to identity as a kind of a scapegoat. Like,
Yep.
if I would say, okay, well, actually, the job I'm doing right now as a 9 to 5 isn't the thing that gives me the most meaning. And then I have that feel like that discomfort of like, okay, but what am I going to do? I think it's something that I've done naturally and I'm trying not to do as much is like just latching on to the very next thing. And for me, it was very similar. It's like, okay, well, maybe I should go start my own company. That's what I'm going to do. Now I have a whole
Right.
new career path in front of me. Perfect. I have a huge, I can climb that ladder of like starting a company. Perfect. And then it's like, oh, but maybe something else, right? Maybe it's YouTubing and podcasting and or coaching. Okay, great. I can build a coaching company. I don't know how you avoided this, but it feels like as soon as I would unlatch myself from one identity, I would immediately
Yep.
feel a need to grab another one.
I think what you're talking through is very common, if not universal, especially for people in their midlife. What you were saying, I see all the time. And I think it is, especially with social media, where you're exposed to all these other people who have it figured out, or so we think, right? And we see their brand and how they live their lives, and we see these usually curated versions of it, and we think, oh, all these other people have it figured out. Why can't I? And I think for me, it was really the problem was I was trying to grasp for that permanent one thing, the one thing to rule them all. Like, where is my calling? And why isn't it presenting itself to me? And life is so unfair because all these other people seem to have a calling, but I don't have a calling, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's a very bad place to be. Now, there are people who stumble into a calling or figure it out, or, lucky them at a young age, they were presented with this clear path in front of them and it forever worked out. Probably didn't, but good for them. I think that for people like us who you don't feel like a whack in the head around, this is exactly what I should be doing, the answer is ironically usually not to like try and grasp onto the next thing, but to really not be searching for that permanent answer and only try and figure out the next answer, or what am I going to do today? What am I going to do tomorrow? What is the thing that like inspires me or interests me or creates curiosity in me today? Not the thing that I like, oh man, if I start a podcast and then, man, I just have to do this for the rest of time and I'm not really a podcaster. Well, I'll never be like Joe Rogan as successful in it, blah, blah. You can go down these paths of comparing yourselves to future versions of yourself that you never become. Then, there becomes the unfulfillment loop and self-talk again. That's, oh, this isn't a good idea. And I think that my situation and my circumstances really enable me to do this a lot. And so I'm grateful for circumstances like having freedom and a lot of financial security to pursue some of these paths. But my frame of reference is not trying to create a goal and then reverse engineer into that goal. It is really to spontaneously pursue interests that are merged to me and not question them, not wonder if they're going to be permanent or not. I just try and do those things, and some of them work, some of them don't. Just for, me and my sort of post-work transition, right? I've tried all different sorts of things. We talked about starting a company, but, I considered coaching, considered being a consultant, I considered advising startups, whether like in a board capacity or in a part-time capacity. I considered doing a nonprofit. I considered starting a podcast. Considered starting a media company, right? Like there's a huge list of things. And, I dabbled in some of them, and then most of them I just let go, right? Because, and again, that's because I'm not grasping to cling on to these things. I can experiment with them and test them without grasping onto them. But even things like writing fiction, which we'll, maybe get into more. When I started writing the book I wrote, I just started writing on the page. I didn't think, well, am I now a writer? Am I now an author? Is this going to be a New York Times bestseller? Is this my career going forward? And am I going to have to do this for the next 10 years, or is this just a little project and impermanent thing I'm doing? That's like the difference in mindset that I come to now, which is to say, I'm not grasping onto this author identity or career. I'm just writing, which I enjoy doing. And I've really continued to find enjoyment in it as much as I keep doing it. And I'm going to keep doing it. And if in a year I don't like it anymore, then fine. I don't have that author identity to say, well, I'm going to discard that and move on. And so your circumstances are very similar. And my advice is usually to not search for something permanent, but search for the next thing that seems most interesting to you and follow it as long as your interest takes you. And then give up on it if it doesn't maintain your interest.
It sounds a lot like the tiny experiments approach. I reread this book this year, and it was a really good reminder to be like,
I haven't read it, but I've heard great things about it.
it's amazing. At least for me, it was a good reinforcement of that idea. Basically, exactly what you're saying, which is like, you can set yourself an amount of time or not. It's up to you, but you can basically set yourself an amount of time and say, I'm gonna play around with this thing. I'm gonna experiment with this thing. I'm gonna get up and write fiction every day for a month. And if I get to the end of the month and I'm just bored of it, it was fun, but like, whatever, it's done, then fine, great. You did an experiment. You learned something about yourself. Move on. It's completely fine.
Yeah, I think it's a great advice. The only thing I would say, and I haven't read the book, so I can't like argue with it or against it, but the only thing I would caution against is the deadlines and timelines. It's good and bad. Good in terms of what you were saying there, in terms of, hey, I want to try a new hobby. I want to try a new, pick up an instrument, start writing a book, right? Like you need to give it some time because you're going to go through that beginner struggle and it's going to suck. And the first page I wrote of my book was horrific. And if I just gave up there, I wouldn't have been able to see where it comes. So deadlines or timelines can be good for getting through that kind of messy middle of struggling through the middle of something. At the same time, especially if you're like me, at least as my experience is, you really need to be careful of the reverse engineering off of the deadline. And I see this a lot in terms of talking with people who have sabbaticals. My advice is to really stretch the sabbatical as long as possible without deadlines. Now, I know that's not financially feasible for everybody, but if you give yourself too harsh of a deadline, like for me, back to me, the 3 months is I'm just too hyper anxious. That 3-month timeline sounds like a deadline to me where I need to figure out my life by that 3 months. And so I back up to that. And it's not a like 3 months of giving myself room. It's in 3 months, I need to have this thing figured out. And if you put all that pressure on yourself to kind of back into that timeline, again, you're grasping for something more extrinsic than intrinsic, which is this thing really, as I try it, as I continually try it, as I even get through that messy middle, do I feel a natural sustainability for it? Or am I artificially imposing outside rewards or deadlines or whatever that is really driving me to want to continue on that path?
Did you feel pressure from other people though, who were like, Rick's still on a sabbatical. Hey man, how's it going? You gonna maybe get a
Yeah,
job or
100%. Million pounds of pressure, whether real and then probably more likely imagined. On the real side, I'll just tell you, I got, again, like I was joked, I was a pretty big deal. And so I knew a lot of executives, investors, people who were interested in my next move and maybe also financially motivated by whatever I decided. That's a kind of like key little factor you have to consider when taking advice from somebody, is how they are potentially incentivized by your decisions. But that's an aside. But I got a whole range of things. One is don't take too much time off. And there is a strong belief, I think, from a lot of people, especially older people, where you don't want to have career breaks. Career breaks signal something is wrong with you. You're unemployed and you're undesirable to the world, but also time away. You lose potentially your understanding of, for my case, healthcare. Like I'm disconnected from the industry, or I lose momentum on my career. I've got this nice like upward momentum. And why would I take away that momentum? So the don't take too much time away approach. Then there's the whole like, you need to do something, man, which is the like, what are you retired or sabbatical? What's that? You're too young to take a break, right? You've only been working, I'm 40. So like you've only been working less than 2 decades. Like most people retire and take time off when they're 65, right? And once you unpack that, you start to realize how much bullshit is underneath there. But it's this idea of like, dude, you don't deserve a break. And that can be a big pressure. And then the third big pressure, which I still grapple with, I'll be really honest, is this whole concept of duty or responsibility, which is given my circumstances in knowledge, expertise, skills, background, do I have a duty to the world to do a certain thing? So for example, healthcare, right? Like it's not like I was selling something bad, right? This was like seriously helping people in a point of need in one of the most messed up systems in the world. If you're in Germany, I think yours is a lot better than ours, but the US is a mess. And there's so many opportunity to help real people with real problems inside of healthcare. And so there's that part of me that says, am I just sort of wasting my opportunity here by not seizing on that duty where I could help a lot of people? That's something I struggle with, right? Because there's a strong pull that way. I really believe in, I don't want to be a guy that just kind of goes off and plays golf all the time. I don't, that sort of pure selfish existence, I think is very not meaningful. But at the same time, I struggle with, is my suffering required for me to help other people, right? And I think the answer to that is no, but it's something I still struggle with.
What's the question underneath? Is it like, oh, I know you said you want to avoid labels, but if I am an author and I'm publishing fiction books, then I'm having less of an impact for the good of humanity than if I would actually go back and be an
Right.
executive and make sure.
Well, if you look at like a popular philosophy, whether explicitly or implicitly, is effective altruism or kind of form of utilitarianism, which is sort of like you look at your work and you multiply your amount of impact per person times the number of people you impact. And it's this like simple equation. You could go online and I think it's like 10,000 hours or something like that, .org, like really just spell
Mhm.
this out in terms of like, this is a simple formula. And so, for example, you could be a doctor who performs surgery and you're going to help less people, but very directly. Or you can be a researcher and create some vaccine, and that's going to help a lot of people, maybe in a smaller way or a more diluted way. Obviously, it helps certain people a lot. And so that thinking it's just like, it's this formula, but something about that doesn't sound right to me. There's something that doesn't sit right. Again, that back to, well, if I am in a circumstance where I could impact a lot of people and impact them deeply, but I hate it the whole time, is that a life well lived? And for these type of questions, I think a lot about my kids. My kids are 5 and 7, and the world is changing very rapidly, obviously, with things like AI. So really trying to think about their future. What would I advise them in the circumstances that I'm in? And when I think about them, I think of, yes, I want them to be helping people, making an impact, but I also don't want them to live a miserable existence where every day is torture. So there's got to be a balance in there where both things can be true.
So the really funny thing, I think the very first episode of this podcast, I had a friend of mine, Phil Bennett, on the show. I think in that episode, I say something where I'm like, but what if I just want to like write books or make art for a living? And I think his response was something like, well, that's underestimating the value and the impact of what like entertainment or
Right.
stories can do for the world and do for people, right? Like that actually,
Yeah.
like how do you measure the value of that anyway compared to anything else? Like, of course, stuff like being a doctor is really quite easy to measure the impact of that, but maybe it gets harder when you think about like creating stories, like the impact is a completely different style of impact, but it's still impactful, right? You're still having a meaningful impact potentially on many, many, many people all around the world.
So I think we underestimate a lot of those softer sides, being a good citizen, being a good neighbor, raising a family where, your kids are balanced and go on to live a strong, meaningful life, right? There's plenty of people, I don't even need to name any of them, you can think of them, but who are highly successful, highly impactful on a business global scale, but their relationships are an utter fucking mess. And their kids are basically all probably living tortured existences because they didn't have the love of their father growing up. And so I think you're right that these softer sides are impactful. And, maybe I'll like do a little bit of a transition into some of the fiction stuff where, I was finding in my own writing. So I write this kind of newsletter, The Way of Work, which really focuses on work, but tangentially a lot around meaning and identity and midlife kind of reinvention and things like that. But over time, I was feeling like, okay, I've told my story in a lot of detail. I don't know how many more times I can tap that well without a little bit more like the therapy chair to go back to repressed memories. And so I've tapped that well. And also, I just kind of honestly, I was just feeling a little bored with it, where I was like, I'm writing self help essays, I guess. And so, I started writing this story. The plot or setting is a post apocalyptic setting that zeroes in on an orphan who is trying to navigate total collapse around him physically and psychologically, and how that orphan, despite all odds, would sort of navigate that situation. And as I was writing that, I was like, all the things that I write about before, meaning, identity, and so on, that's all really embedded in here. And so why don't I address those deeper themes within a fun plot? I like the, analogy of the Matrix, right? Which is on the surface, the Matrix is like super cool CGI and like doing flips and dodging bullets and cool action scenes. But on a deeper level, it's really a allegory about man versus machine, this great philosophical question of art. Is life really a simulation? And has themes about like escaping a default life and so on. But it's all hidden within this very cool, actiony, plot forward story. And I thought, why don't I try and do the same thing? And so that's what I've tried to do, is communicate some of these deeper, heavier themes within a totally made up story, which for some reason almost feels like I can sort of access the truth better through the imaginary than if I tried to retell my childhood, which would totally be boring and uninteresting. Might be true, but no one would want to read it.
Have you done fiction writing earlier in your life? Or it sounds like you had this idea kind of organically from writing lots of nonfiction and then being like, oh, maybe fiction is a way to explore it, but it like never came up earlier in your life?
No, no, no. And in fact, I'm thinking about after we were, scheduling this, I started thinking about like a post of something like how to be creative if you're not a creative person or something like that. I got to work on the title, but there's really no evidence that I'm like an artsy or creative person. Never liked art, not into drawing or painting. I was never really into music. I did it because I kind of like had to, I think. I never like wrote stories to myself or anything. I hated like English class. And so there was all this kind of evidence that, Rick, you're just a practical, boring man. So just do practical, boring stuff. And that's why the business world worked great for me for a while. But I had this kind of no evidence of like, deeper creativity or artistic sense. But like I said, when I was doing this writing, I've always loved reading fiction. That's always been a part of me. So I've read way too many productivity self-help books too, but I've always been into kind of sci-fi, fantasy reading, very kind of out there type of stuff. It was always a fun way to sort of detach from the real world, maybe in a partially escapist way, but a lot of the best sci-fi fantasy allows you to kind of think about real life, but in this kind of fantastical universe. And so anyways, I always really enjoyed it. And I had this kind of just idea in the back of my head of like, what if I wrote a fiction story? And I'll be honest with you, I didn't outline this. I didn't develop a huge plot. I really started with a simple prompt, which is, and I'm really sorry, but I'm going to spoil this book if you haven't read it, The Road. So if you want to pause, I'm going to spoil it. But I started with a simple prompt to say, what if we follow the little boy in the road after his dad dies? Like, where does that take him? And that immediately helped me sort of picture the setting and the mood and the having total nothingness in life, very little support as a vulnerable orphan. And that's where the story came out, is that very small, simple prompt. And I just sat down one Monday and I started writing on a Google Doc with only that prompt, and it sucked. Like I said, the first chapter really sucked. It's been revised about 100 times. And then I sat down Tuesday and I wrote some more, and then Wednesday, and then the ideas just like exploded out of me. I couldn't stop for like 6 months. I'm still on it. And just the ideas came out of me, and I would have never predicted. Again, I keep saying like reverse engineering. I got to find a new way to frame this so I don't repeating myself. But like if I had reverse engineered to say, oh, I want to write a book. I want it to be this type of book. I want it to be popular in this way or sell this many copies. Or like if I had tried to create that vision and then re-engineer from there, I would have never gone through these initial steps just to let's see where this interest takes me. And then it turned out it took me very far. Now we could be having you could have this conversation with someone else where they sit down and they write Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, even let's say they do it a month. And then after the month, they're like, Mike, this still sucks. And I hate this. Like this whole process sucks. Well, then fine. Like you don't need to kill yourself and torture yourself. But again, you don't necessarily know unless you try. So that's my journey.
You mentioned that you have this kind of like passion for it now where all the ideas are like overflowing and you're just like obsessing over it. And I wonder, how do you actually practically stop that voice coming back that's like, you're going to be a best-selling author and you're going to make this the best thing ever and you're going to learn everything and you could use this tool, you could optimize your workflow like this and you could get a writing group and feedback and blah, blah, blah. Like all of this stuff. I don't know, maybe it's different for you. Did you have that onslaught of like, you know, expectations and pressure and ideas and like process and like, how do you stop the flow, you know?
Yes. 100% yes. I would say, luckily I'm more mindful in this stage than I was maybe like earlier in my career, but 100%. The funny thing too, is everybody likes to think, hey, it would be so great to have an existing audience. And if you're a writer, then it'd be, readers and so on. It'd be really great to have this inbuilt audience that when I publish my next thing, I just have this huge audience. It's true in a lot of respects, but also not having an audience frees you from expectations quite a bit. And that can be a very freeing process. So I think that was one thing where I didn't really have to fulfill expectations. I just did the thing and enjoyed doing the thing. Now, invariably, when you start to really get into any project in any depth, I'm sure, the same with podcasting, is your imagination starts to run wild. Oh, where could this go? And like all that different things. And to your questions, like, am I really this type of person? What would this type of person do? What are all the tools and things that I need to do them? And some of that stuff, honestly, can be useful, right? It's not like when writing a book, it's helpful to talk to people who've written a book and figure out what works and not, and learning how to write sentences and stories and all that stuff is super valuable. I think it just goes back to the concept we were talking about of like not falling into the new identity and new culture. And creative culture has its own thing, as I'm sure you and your listeners know, right? Where like artists are these type of people who think these type of things. And, we go to coffee shops and we wear these type of clothes and, like our backgrounds have these type of visuals behind us. Like, right. There's all this kind of like identity stuff wrapped up even in a creative culture too. And the key is to just not chase any of that. It is really to say, I am writing. Am I a writer? I don't know. Maybe someday I'll come to that conclusion. But I am just going to keep doing the writing that gives me intrinsic joy. I will say too that over time I have, like when it comes to writing, like the business side of my brain has popped on in terms of things like how do I get this published and what's the market for this book? And, some of that has actually been kind of fun to sort of tap into that business side again of like, oh, this is actually a product in which I'm trying to sell and I'm trying to find my customers and what's the right outcome and what is the outcome that I'm trying to get to? Is it really money? Is it trying to get readers? Is it trying to just continue writing? And so I think just being mindful through this whole process in terms of what you are actually doing and trying to do, and then being wary of those ditches along the way that can bring you back to the problems that got you here in the first place, right? All that's important.
It sounds like a lot of it is also just like regularly checking in with yourself. If you're really enjoying the thing, do you feel pulled to do it or do you feel pushed to do it? And like, how much are you like actually enjoying it?
It's a very subtle distinction, right? And I don't know if I have a good answer in terms of how you separate the two. And certainly, I'm like bouncing, I may be contradicting myself in some ways when life is all a paradox, but like I think that in terms of like my post-work angst, well, that fueled a lot of creative energy too. And I would say a lot of the fiction book I wrote was based off of my fear of death and my fear of losing loved ones. And so, is that good motivation to be sort of fueled by some of these fears or these angst or these issues and anxieties? Where's that like negative fuel, right? It's kind of hard to know because a lot of the writing has helped me actually also process a lot of those feelings and emotions. So I think that's very positive. But then you could kind of say like, well, are you drawing from a bad source, right? It's the songwriter that writes a hit song after a breakup, right? Like, okay, is that positive energy? Is that negative energy, right? And it's sometimes hard to know. All I can tell you though is that tapping that creative fuel is really an enjoyable experience. Whether the fuel itself is negative or positive, man, it's a good hit.
This is something that I sometimes struggle with. I kind of enjoy it, but I struggle with it too. Like when I get hit with an idea or like something is really taking my attention creatively or otherwise, it's like so hard to turn your brain off. Or at least for me, it's like I'm writing so much more on my newsletter, and the more I do that, the more I get into it, and then the more ideas I have, and then like I'm like
Yep.
eating breakfast with my girlfriend. I'm like, oh my god, I have to go write. Like I'm so sorry, but
Yeah.
like I just have to go. I have to go write this down. It's
Yeah.
stupid, but like I need to do it. Like
Yeah.
somehow then I question that, and I'm like, what am I doing? Like I've just replaced like a work
Right.
obsession. My 9 to 5 career path is is taking less space in my brain. Great. But now I have this like uncontrollable, like the tap is fully turned on and I can't get like
Yeah.
like I can't, it's not a reliable stream. It's just like it comes out full blast and I have to go and
Yep.
do all those things. And I'm like, oh, that's not sustainable. Like, or with the podcast, they're like, oh, I could do this, I could do that. It's so hard to find the right, yeah, I don't know. Maybe there is not a right way. Maybe it's just go with the energy and
Yeah.
screw it.
I think that in a lot of ways, tapping into that obsession is a beautiful thing. And I mean, like anybody who's been in that sort of idea flow state knows what we're talking about, where, man, it's just like a beautiful thing. And you don't want to turn off the faucet. You want it to keep going. In fact, in a lot of ways, you worry that it's going to end. And it probably will end, right, at some point. And I have the same issues around when I was in the kind of meat of writing the book. I'd be sitting at dinner with my family, my wife and 2 kids, and they'd be talking about something, and I'm just like drifting off. And I'm like, oh, man, this would be a really cool scene in the book. And oh my gosh, I got to go write it down. But then at the same time, wait, like that, a lot of that behavior is kind of reminiscent of like my workaholic days of like, I'd get home from the office and my mind would just be still running and ruminating. And some of that might have been stress that really hadn't been resolved. And what's the difference between the two? It's hard to know. I think you just sort of have to try and be as mindful as you can in this process. But at the same time, if you fall in love with something, someone, like it's always best not to question it in some ways, right? Like, do you really need to over intellectualize this problem of falling in love with something? I don't know. Certainly, I'm sure there's reverse rebuttals to that case that you can easily come up with. But I think it's allowing yourself to fall into the flow of the experience, but then also picking yourself up continually. Say, is this a positive flow or is this a negative flow? Because I don't think you can kind of 100% be in the flow of an experience, right? You got to go to bed, you got to do other things in your life, you got to go to work, you got to do the dishes, so on. But then at the same time, like if you're over intellectualizing everything, then you're not really in the moment. You're never getting into those flow states, which are really very powerful and positive. I don't have an answer is the answer, maybe.
The concept we're talking about is similar, but I've heard of it described as like de-stress versus oistress. Like the idea
Yeah.
that like maybe not all stress is bad, or like it's more complicated than that in reality. Like there are some things that are going to stress us in a way that might not be that bad for us, and there are of course things that are going to stress us and be very bad for us. But if we lump it all together and we associate all stress as bad, then that's not really helping. The only thing that that will do is make us feel guilty for feeling stressed, even if it's coming from like a positive creative space. But probably easier said than done, right? Like this is a complete segue as well, but I wonder if for you, when you started writing fiction, was there any part of you that was like, yeah, but this is kind of silly. Like, what am I doing? I'm not an author. Like,
Yeah.
was there any fear associated with even telling people, oh, I'm writing fiction?
Oh, 100%. I still struggle to tell family and friends that I wrote a book. In fact, it's very common in family gatherings for, somebody asks like, hey, Rick, what have you been up to? And I'm like, same old. And then my wife will be like, he wrote a book. Like, and that she's the spark. She's the spark to generate the conversation. It's almost like I'm embarrassed about it a little bit. And I do think in a lot of ways it kind of, for whatever reason, I I've always respected writers, and they're probably all my idols are writers, I would say. And so I respect the profession, and I take people who have written great works of fiction very seriously. And at the same time, yeah, it does feel like a childish pursuit. It's very kind of odd dichotomy. And that's why I've tried to resist. Like, I kind of know that, like, I feel these things are, I wouldn't say knowing these things are childish is the wrong way to put it. There's a part of me that is saying, hey, this is a childish thing. And then there's another side of me that's just like, Rick, that voice is BS. Like, do the thing. But yeah, I think that we have a certain value to different pursuits in our life. And I would say especially in America, heavily capitalist society, everything is a question of, can you monetize this or that? Even your hobbies now, everything is, you're really into making model trains. Can you monetize that? Can you become a creator and have a YouTube channel where you monetize that passion? Everything is just really a question of what's the monetary value that it generates. And when we reduce all these activities to that basic concept, you lose a lot. There is a ton of things, most good things in life, love, meaning, connection. Like, you don't actually monetize any of that stuff. There's no market for it. The best things in life don't have a monetary value. And yet we try and qualify it for that. So I think that's where a lot of the childish view comes in. I think there's also a nature of a lot of artistic pursuits, which are the most likely outcome is you are irrelevant. It's a nature of, and I'm sure podcast has like, the power law distribution, right? If I'm naming it correctly, but like music writers, right? It's the 0.0001% that actually become very popular and big. If you're not that, then it's a childish, useless pursuit. But I guarantee you, if I became a New York Times bestseller and sold 10 million copies of my book, everyone would be like, wow, that like, it's so great, right? We'd be having a different conversation about how can I chase my dreams of writing a book that makes millions of dollars and things like that, right? And so I think artistic endeavors really are most likely irrelevant. So they're going to be seen as irrelevant by most people. And I think that luckily there are creative, artistic people who understand the intrinsic value of these things, and they will appreciate it and they will see the value. Most people won't. I mean, I don't know any other way to put it. And I think that for people who might be listening who are kind of thinking, oh, like, oh, well, how do I make my creative endeavor, artistic endeavor more serious and be taken more seriously? I think it's probably the wrong question to ask. It's a really, again, trying to anchor in that kind of extrinsic proving somebody else a point versus sort of intrinsically loving the craft, appreciating it for its own sake, and trying to come at it from that perspective seems like a lot more of a positive route.
It feels like I would think that if you ask most people, would you rather do something that earns you money, but you hate it, or do something that doesn't earn you that much money, but you feel this like creative passion and you're super fulfilled and you really, really enjoy it, that they would want to at least spend some of their time doing the creative thing, right? Like monetization just cannot be the goal of most
Right.
stuff in your life, I feel like, which is again something I'm just saying to myself to remind myself.
I have this incomplete thought that I'll share with you. So I allow myself to revise myself in the future. But a lot of people think that the best work is work that will pay them a lot of money. You get paid to do the thing you love. I actually think that the best work is actually work you would pay to do. It would not only be free, but it is so good that you would want to pay to do it. You're willing to lose money to do it. And maybe that sounds like a hobby, and maybe that's what I'm describing. I really think that the best work is not necessary. Like, if you ever get to a place, I'm in a very lucky financial situation and I'm very privileged to have the success I've had at a young age. And at the same time, I also know a lot of people who are very well off. I think the irony is that even when you have enough money, there is still a seduction to the pull of money of any kind. And it warps your sense. It's everything we've been talking about. It warps your sense of value, what is good in the world. You might have a business opportunity, say, just a simple example. Someone could come to me with a business opportunity, a consulting gig or whatever, and say, we're going to pay you a lot of money for very little work. And I could look at that and be like, wow, like, look at all the things I could buy with that, or I could give away the money, or it's just very concrete value that I get in return. But then when I disconnect the money for that and say, well, would I do this if I wasn't paid? I wouldn't. And I think that for people, especially midlife and up, who have maybe secured a level of success, they're still too seduced by the value of money, and it warps their understanding of what they should or should not be doing. And that's why people wake up later in life and be like, well, why didn't I do what I really wanted to do? Well, you chase the things that, you thought you wanted to do. It's self-deception. It's not, no one's deceiving you except yourself.
I mean, it's such a tricky thing when it comes to the financial situation, because this even goes back to like Tim Ferriss and the 4 Hour Work Week, where I hope I'm not misquoting and getting the wrong book, but I think in that book he mentions like a lot of people would come to him and say, I hope I will eventually be financially free because then I can like travel the world or like quit my job and write fiction. And then he like asked them, okay, well, how much money do you think you actually need to do that now? And then they break it down and it's like, oh, well, yeah, but, oh, yeah, well, okay, maybe it's only 1,000 years or more. Yeah, well, it still doesn't quite work for me or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's weird that we set some like arbitrary massive goal and are like, oh, only when we reach that goal, or only when we retire can
Yep.
we then do the thing that really actually fulfills us and we really want to do. I still have this battle where I'm like, again, I'm doing all these things that creatively fulfill me. I'm doing the podcast. I don't expect to make much money with it. I'm writing both fiction and nonfiction a lot more in my life and really enjoying that. But there is a thing of like, well, I'm not in a position where I can just quit my job. So I do have this battle where I'm like, okay, well, what am I actually going to do then? Like, do I keep the
Yeah.
job and accept that most of my days will go
Yeah.
towards making pretty good money so I can do all the other stuff in my free time? Or do I really want to pick one of these things and monetize it so I can do less of the thing that is not as exciting? Like, it is a challenge. And I mean, I don't think there is one easy answer to that question, but
The problem is when what you said in there, which is the either or thinking. It's like I either do one extreme or the other
right,
extreme. And the one extreme, what you were referencing there with Tim Ferriss, and I see this a lot myself, is I'll wait until I'm ready to do X, Y, Z. The reality is we don't know how long we've got. And a lot of people I wouldn't say content, but they feel as though they should torture themselves for this long-term goal of freedom, which is a whole other topic. I've written a lot about freedom and how it's not as good as people think it is. And I really believe that if people tie themselves too strongly to this idea of freedom, they'll be disappointed when they get to the other side of it, when they realize, oh, this is just a stepping stone and I need to figure out what next that I do. So I think that frame of thinking is problematic. I also think that I'll just quit my job and pursue this creative endeavor is also, maybe it works. I mean, I guess you can always find a story of somebody who figured it out, right? But it's very unlikely. At least, right, we could probably agree it's unlikely to work out. And I think that being naive, that artistic or creative, or let's just say being naive to think exactly what you want to do is therefore going to automatically have a financial market to pay you to do exactly what you want to do. I think you're being very naive if you think like those things will just mesh in this. I hate the Venn diagram of the gosh,
Ikigai.
yeah, Ikigai, yeah, like everything is just going to merge in this perfect Venn diagram. And it's like, that's a theoretical concept, dude. Like it's not real life. And you might find that moment for like a second. And then the next second, like the circles spread apart from each other. So I think it's very naive to think that. I do think though, I mean, I'll just give you the honest truth. Like I have this saying, which is like, the best way to become a rich writer is to become rich and then become a writer. Because I just think there are like way better ways to make money. And if you look just practically at anyone doing some sort of creative pursuit, certainly more on a full time basis, I basically guarantee you 99% of the time, it was funded by something else, at least at first for a while, or it's funded indirectly through some other means. And this is especially true of the creator universe where people are making YouTube videos or podcasts. And, what they're really making money from is this side product or side solution, or they really have a full time job and that is funding this project. Or they saved up money, or they have a nest egg, or their parents, their trust fund babies, or like something is funding this enterprise, at least for a long time. I'm talking like 10 years, because that's usually at least what it takes for a lot of these overnight successes to become successes. And only then, after you go through that sort of ramp up period, do a few people find stability. And even then, you talk to, as I've written, one of the authors I like following is Brandon Sanderson, who has a really great, if anybody out there, like look up Brandon Sanderson lectures if you want to learn how to write stories and write book. But this guy has sold hundreds of millions of copies. Like he doesn't need to work ever again, but he's writing like 3 books a year at like you can just tell he's like at a nervous pace. And I think a lot of it goes back to this insecure, I don't want to project on him, but for a lot of people, it's this sort of insecurity that like, if I don't write my next thing or have my next output, that I'm going to lose this thing that I've got. And so there really is no point of stability in any of these creative endeavors, or really like many professions anymore, where like it's just set it and forget it and you're good. And so back to your question, I think you really should be thoughtful about how you improve. If you want to do something creative, there is sort of a menu of options. One is to quit everything and do it right now. Highly risky. The other is to wait until the stars are aligned and it's perfect. It's never going to be. Like, then there's a bunch of middle stuff, which is you have a full-time job and you do it on the side, or you save up for a period of time and then take some time off. You maybe if you're in a horrible job that is meaningless, you try and find a less horrible, slightly more meaningful job and you stair step your way that way. But in all cases, the funding almost universally comes from somewhere else. I mean, just dig under the surface of any of these people.
I think it's something that I've learned from doing this podcast, even though what I describe is like, I have that temptation to fall into this like either or thinking. I think the reality is, like, from talking to so many people doing creative work, is that there are so many options and there are always more options than you think. And no one really has it all figured out. Like, everyone I've spoken to is like, oh no, yeah, I work 3 days on the side, or I also have a coaching business which funds my filmmaking business, or whatever it is, right? There are so many different approaches that you can take. And yeah, probably the reality is a bit less glossy.
Yeah. And I think the other reality is like, many people are making much harder sacrifices than most people would. A guy that comes to mind is Paul Millard, The Pathless Path, who I don't want to overshare, but I think he's publicly been very clear about his circumstances. He lives abroad very cheaply. He lives on a very low income per year. He doesn't own a home. He doesn't have sort of a lot of the long-term stability of a huge 401k and things like that. But those circumstances has allowed him to live a pretty remarkable life. And I think the problem is when people try to have it all. Like, I want to live in a high cost area with a huge mansion and send my kids to private school and have 2 luxury cars and blah, 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 right? And then I also want my art to support my lifestyle. Well, you're just being naive. I'll be honest with you, right? Like, the reason I'm here, I'll let you be very honest. The reason I'm here writing fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction about the end of the world or whatever, is because I worked really hard. And I also got lucky in a, business enterprise that is funding this stage of my life. It's just like I've made $0 from my writing. I probably on this book will lose money. Like I said, it's more likely that I lose money on writing this book, even if it's a great book. And so I just think, be honest. And if you're honest, then you can kind of take practical steps to say, okay, I understand the situation. I'm not deceiving myself. I still want to do it, but I need to make these sacrifices in order to do it. That's great. Like, God bless. I really wish more people would take steps like that for all the reasons we talked about.
How much is the like a background pressure for you? Like, okay, but if I don't, if writing fiction isn't the thing, then what am I going to do? Or at some point I'll run out of money. So then what am I going to do?
Yeah. I'll figure it out. Honestly. Yeah, no, I really am comfortable that I'll figure it out. And I think that, let's be honest and clear, like, I have more financial runway than I think most people do. It's not like a 6-month sabbatical type of thing. And so I have a lot more runway. And at the same time, I also, there's a lot of scenarios where I can run out of money fast. It's very easy to do so too. But I guess I'm confident in my ability to figure it out when the time comes, if I need to pivot. And it's like all the things we were just talking about, right? Like, which is, okay, I live in a high cost living area. I live outside of Washington, D.C. We'll move out. Don't need to have as nice of stuff. I'm trying to work on my long-term health. And so I'm working with a personal trainer right now to like, I've got back problems, like I'm really spending a lot of money there. Okay. I don't need that. Right. Like, so I think we're talking about a whole other topic too, when just going back to your thought before about like having a number and like, I've got to reach this number and state. One of the biggest problems I see in the financial independence or FIRE movement is this concept of a concrete number that you get to and then check, you're done. When the reality is life is far more dynamic before and after, where if you approach the problem with more of an adaptability mindset, which is it's a little bit more like Paul Miller, the example is like a more of an extreme example, but I will be adaptable to my circumstances and twist and weave as I go. Then you can actually, I think, find a lot more flexibility and freedom earlier than if you're like, I need this perfect number on a spreadsheet where everything adds up and I'm done. That's different, and it's not going to work out well for you.
It seems really freeing to be like, yeah, I'll figure it out. Like whatever it is, the situation, I can figure it out. I have options. There are always things you can tweak in life. I mean,
Right. People need to assess their own situation. And so if they're not like me in terms of having as much of a war chest or runway, then take stock of other assets where you could be your professional assets of like, I have a really good network. I have a good job, or I have an expertise in demand and so on. Like there are these other assets that you can accumulate to say, like, I can potentially have all these, if I were to take a year off as an example, like I wouldn't actually lose as much momentum or opportunity as I think. Now, the other listen, if you're 20 years old starting out and you're massively in debt and you have no skills or expertise in anything, like buckle up, buddy, because like you're gonna have to, like, there's just you cannot have it all, right? Like that's just the way it is, right? And so take my advice or situation with a grain of salt or in context or the nuance, right? It depends on the person. And so to some people, I'm a privileged asshole. That's fine. Like I get it. And some people, like my advice is fresh and welcome because it matches their mentality and circumstances. So yeah, it is what it is.
yeah, I still think like ultimately it is freeing to just, I guess it's like ultimately, regardless of your circumstances, realizing that you are resourceful and you do have the ability to figure things out in your life. And I guess I don't think you have to be in a position of privilege to realize and accept that, right? Like, as you said,
Right.
maybe you're 20 years old and you still don't know what you're going to do, but like,
Yeah.
you can still believe that you're resourceful and you'll figure it out and try something out and see how it goes, right? As long as you're checking in with yourself and
Right.
figuring out where you're going and if the direction feels good, and just continuously do that forever, I guess. Because otherwise, at some point, you hit the arrival fallacy and you're like, oh, okay, okay, well, I hit the goal that I thought I had. What do I do now? Like,
Yep.
I hit the
Right.
end of the road. Great. What
Yep.
am I going to do?
Yep. Exactly.
I could also talk about this literally forever, I think. I think these topics are really, really fascinating. I do have two final questions for you. We talked about so many different topics. What would be like one main takeaway for the people who got to the end of this episode?
I would just encourage more people to follow their artistic inklings, creative inklings in whatever weird way they take you. Don't try and govern yourself and overthink it. And is this weird? And is this going to make money and all that stuff? Like if you have a interest or curiosity, like scratch that itch and just follow it. Because I think that that's where the good stuff is in life. Now, if you're kind of always got this like second self that's commenting on your experiences and analyzing and over intellectualizing it, you're really not going to have a fun life. But I would really just encourage people, whatever it is, if you want to play an instrument, just try it. If you want to pick up a paintbrush, try it. If you want to write something, just write one post or try something. Don't think that it's the permanent solution. Just try it. Try it out. You don't know where it'll take you.
Nice. Fully agree. Second question, is there like one book or resource that you would recommend to everyone? I mean, actually, it can be more, to be honest, especially if you're fiction, nonfiction, everything.
Yeah, so I think that a number of books have really, since we've been talking a lot about transitions, and I think that a lot of people in kind of in this space are like navigating different identities and transitioning from one to the other. The two books that I would really recommend is Working Identities. I think it's Working Identities. Working Identities. Here, I got the two books here.
Go there, ready to go.
I'm ready to go. All right. So book number one is Working Identity by Herminia Ibarra. And it is by far the best book about work transitions, where when I was reading it, I was really like, I was annoying my wife all the time, where it's like, Alicia, like, listen to this. This is exactly what I'm feeling. Like, she's saying exactly what I'm feeling. It really like spoke perfectly to all the angst. When you're going through kind of a hard transition, it's useful to have someone say that. And it's a it's also a very practical book too. So that's helpful. And then the other book is, I recommend this the most, is David Brooks' The Second Mountain. And it's very kind of, a lot of people know it, but if you don't know it, he talks about the first and second mountains. The first mountain being a lot of what I described as my own first mountain, which is chasing achievement, chasing professional success and status and money, and how a lot of people, when they do that, normally around midlife, sometimes earlier, start to say, like, is this really it? And so he talks about climbing that first mountain, descending into the wilderness, the valley, that get lost phase we were talking about, but then really coming out of it for what he calls your second mountain, which he describes as kind of a marriage to a new calling or vocation or cause or relationship that really helps drive you. And so I think it's a very good reframing or new lens for people who grew up in a very capitalistic, high achievement, work hard and succeed type of atmosphere. So those are the two I end up recommending the most.
Damn, nice. One of my favorite parts of the show is I just always constantly increase my to read list.
And read some fiction, I would recommend, like it's, self-help after a point, you're just like, man, I'm done with this. And fiction actually can contain sometimes a lot more wisdom than nonfiction, as I'm realizing. So again, back to like my advice number one, which is like follow those weird interests wherever they are. Could be the strangest sounding thing, but it's probably worth it.
Get weird with it. That's going to be the title of the episode.
Get weird with it. Okay. Hey.
Greg, thanks so much for coming on. It's been really, really great.
Thanks, Mike.